Well, the class is called Winter Happens. This is the clothing class, the 2001. And just the concept that people are very poorly prepared to live without shelter and or utilities. As always, we're talking about self-reliance, and it's really being prepared for the future and whatever may come, or you end up being a victim. We have the choice of whether we're going to be a victim or not. Living providently really is based on principles, and that is the key to self-reliance, and that's why I talk about how and why things work, not just lists of things you need to get. Because it really comes down to the key to self-reliance is living providently. Provident living is making provisions for the future, but it has to be based on correct principles. If it's based on somebody's nice idea, it may not work for you. And so I find that it's very important for you to always back things up to principle. What's the underlying thing here? Just a quick idea. I like blue, you like red. That's a preference. That is not a principle. But how something would work where it's an unchanging law, if you will, that would be a principle. So we want to understand the laws of physics, the laws of the physical world when we're dealing with physical types of things. As always, I consider the truth about life to be that there's no doubt that tomorrow will come, and there's no dispute that things happen. But how you're prepared to meet tomorrow will make all the difference in the world. If you're prepared for the worst, then no matter what happens, it will be an adventure. So let's make it an adventure rather than stumbling into some catastrophe. True preparedness is based on principles. It's not just lists of things to buy and stuff to store away, because you need to understand that what you know is far more important than what you have, what's inside of you, who you are, what you stand for. The true preparedness principles, there's a list of 8 of them. We won't touch on them here very much at all. Those are covered in other classes and courses. As a matter of fact, the one that we did last week touches on them in a little greater depth. That is prepared to survive no matter what. That's the Foundation Class 1001. You can also learn about those principles in the Foundation DVD, one that's been out for quite a while, but it's full of these. We sell it very inexpensively because we want people to have these things and get started. The law of provident living, most of you may have seen this list before. Spiritual, attitude, knowledge, and stuff, and it has to be in that order. The law of stewardship contains these 3 main components: authority, responsibility, and accountability. Obey these things and it works well. Break them and it's trouble. The law of the parachute simply says this: you got to have it before you need it, and it better be working right. It's exactly the same way when you jump out of a plane as it would be for an emergency or a disaster, because once the disaster has occurred, it has no responsibility for your well-being. That is yours. So it's all about attitudes, knowledge, skills, and of course the supplies and material things that you have. These 9 core preparedness modules that I talk about, and this is where we're doing each one of these classes. Everything you need to know, do, and have is contained in these 9 areas. We'll be going through 9 of them and digging into them deeper and deeper, and of course publishing these materials too. Tonight it is all about clothing. So where does this class fit into the overall curriculum, this class we call Weather Happens, this overview? Well, as always, the mission of this company and its people is to reach and teach as many people as we can, and to help people understand that winter is an ally, not an enemy. Hot weather can be an ally, not an enemy, if you know how to work with it. There's a whole series of classes, and you'll be seeing more and more of these in the future. When we take a look at the clothing series, there it is at the blue aerial right at the top. It's the introduction to these things. If you take a look at some of the breakdown from a graphical standpoint on some of the major classes, there it is again. And of course, each one of these fits into this overall curriculum. Now, you know, sometimes people think of clothing just as something that you wear, something that you put on. But we have to look at it differently from a provident living standpoint. Clothing can be considered any item, any personal item that you're going to, you know, surround yourself with to protect yourself from the environment. We can describe clothing as being personal portable shelter, but it has a little more to it than just what we think of as being cloth that you would put on. There are these 5 clothing categories. We will touch on only 2 of them. the everyday wear, an expanded perspective, specialized hot condition clothing, cold condition clothing. We'll be talking about hot and cold primarily this evening, and in other classes in greater depth. Traditional everyday wear, it's all about how you look and how you make people think about you because of what you're wearing. We don't talk too much about that because some of it doesn't fit in any place in Provident living as far as I'm concerned. In this area of expanded perspective, we're looking for answers to things, and it makes things that you wouldn't normally think of as clothing, let's say the outside world out there outside of our world of Provident living, wouldn't think of these things as being clothing. But really, nighttime clothing is what we call bedding. It's a sleeping bag. It allows you to be comfortably resting, whether it's inside or outside. You put it on at night to augment the insulation if it's cold so that you can sleep comfortably. So that is, in fact, clothing. We can look at some of these things we'd call specialized protective clothing. That is, you're looking to solve a problem, an answer for something. Well, this would include all kinds of things that you can put on, wear for your eyes, for your hands, for your head, for specialized things, even breathing. Any of these things, including sunscreen and insect repellent, could be looked at as being clothing. You wear them, they give you personal protection, so they fit into that category, some of them being more important than others. And again, in the more in-depth classes, we spend more time in these things to help you understand them. People can easily handle mild conditions, comfortable weather, a shirt sleeve weather as we would call it, where there isn't any wind and rain and snow and insects and extreme heat or cold. That's just easy to live with. But when we talk about heat and extreme heat, clothing really becomes more than just something you wear, just apparel, because overheating is very unpleasant, but it's also extremely stressful to the body. And serious overheating literally can cause injury. It can cause death. And this is where it's so very, very important that you pay attention, because people have died in extreme heat very, very quickly. Well, when we look at extreme heat and we want to solve these problems, it really is about protection. It's about the performance. And safety is what we're really concerned about. And a benefit of all of this, of course, will be improved comfort. And most people, particularly in this country, have no clue how to dress in the extreme heat. It's generally considered the more you take off, the better, and that's absolutely wrong. So people are poorly prepared to deal with extreme heat on their own, meaning that they're outside. And so what we have a cultural habit of doing is we just scurry from one box that's cooled to another. And some of these boxes are on wheels and some of them are on foundations. And what happens is people dislike the heat, they avoid the heat, they're afraid of the heat, they curse the heat, and they don't want to be around the heat. Well, heat happens, weather happens. And what's important is that you learn to live by the principles of hot weather clothing. And this is the class where we dig into that in much greater depth. It is Foundation Class 2102, Hot Weather Safety and Heat Injury Avoidance. And it really is about clothing. Because when you have utilities that are broken down when you're stuck out there, it's all about the clothing and other practices. It isn't just clothing, of course. It's other things that fit into that. So this class the 2102, is truly about clothing, but other things to take into consideration. When you take a look at the hot weather clothing functions, and this is where we're getting right down to these kind of basic principles about how and why things work. It is about proper clothing, because your body has a lot of automatic systems that it uses, and the clothing will assist in the body's automatic functions to prevent overheating. So it's about enhancing the evaporative cooling from the skin. It's about shielding the skin from the sun's ultraviolet rays. It's about reducing the direct heating of the skin from the sun. And it's also about protecting from biting and stinging insects. One of the advantages you can say about living in below zero conditions is no snakes, no insects, no mosquitoes, no ugly things you have to deal with. So we would consider clothing to give us protection in all of those areas. Hot weather clothing, the key performance principles you have to be paying attention to is the fabric and material considerations. This is more important than most people understand. It's also the features and designs of clothing. hats and footwear, all of these things come into play. And again, in class 2102, we go into those things in great depth to help you understand how to deal with the cold and with the heat and extreme heat. Here's some more of these principles to understand. The human body has some wonderful automatic systems to prevent overheating, because severe heating is definitely a hazard to us, not to mention uncomfortable. The things that happen automatically in the body is that the circulation changes. It literally changes to move the heat from the inside to the outside and dump it out of the body as much as we possibly can quickly. And of course, you have perspiration on the surface of the skin that's helping to enhance that also. And that's where proper clothing is designed to enhance that, so you get better cooling from that improved circulation to the surface. The body's metabolism will drop. That's to reduce the heat generation. That's why in the high heat, there's a tendency to slow down. There's a tendency to want to take a nap, a siesta, if you will, in the heat of the afternoon. That's your body's automatic system saying, hey, let's don't push this so hard. So when your world is hot, it's extremely important that you apply the knowledge that you have, because that will make all the difference in the world, and that's where these principles become very important. It is this applied knowledge that is you want to be using. What it comes back to is it's to learn the laws and live the laws, or you end up suffering the consequences. Hopefully the consequences are just discomfort and stress rather than injury or something worse. That's where we come back to this idea of provident living, and within provident living is one of those key points. From the top down in provident living, it's spiritual attitude, knowledge, and stuff. All of those things come into play. Knowledge being extremely important to understand how and why things work, but also understanding that if you have an attitude about how much you hate the heat, and how much you don't like the heat, and how much you wish you weren't here, that won't help. And in some cases, it can truly make things worse. The law of stewardship, because see, it's about responsibility. You have to take care of these things. The responsibility is yours to be prepared for the heat. And it's about the law of the parachute, which ties in with responsibility very well, because you have to take care of things before you need them, including not only the learning, but also the material things that you need to have. Proper clothing. This again is a knowledge idea where it's based on performance, not style or habit. And if you want to be prepared, style is secondary. The cultural things become secondary, is how does it work. Vital hydration. This is another knowledge concept, because you have to understand this. You have to practice it, because if you don't, it will impact your well-being, your strength. You will become hurt. As a matter of fact, this is one of the things that can get you in trouble very, very quickly. And tying right in with the idea of hydration is hot weather nutrition. And they go hand in hand. And in particular, we're talking about some of the nutrients, these salts that you need in the body, the sodium salts, the potassium salts, the magnesium salts, and many of these things, the electrolytes we call them, because they help to balance the chemistry within the cells of the body and outside of the cells and within the blood. So if you're just drinking water alone, that can become very, very hazardous if you're perspiring and working hard in the heat. So these things are vitally important that you understand. The bottom line being this, that even extremely hot weather need not be a threat to you if you will learn and obey the rules. So those things will be covered in greater depth in the future classes. Now, there is another season of extremes to be working with, and that is the winter and the cold weather. People can, of course, easily handle when conditions are mild. But people are very poorly prepared to deal with winter when they're cast out of these warm boxes that we have. Whether the box is no longer warm or whether you're separated from that warm box, people dislike winter, the cold. The cold is very draining to the body. It's very, very challenging to be out in the cold and have your body temperature going down, you slow down. So winter happens is what it comes down to. And you need to be prepared so that you can deal with it. If you lose utilities and you have shelter, that's one way. Or if you get stuck outside, how do you take care of those things? Well, winter safety and cold weather injury avoidance is one where we teach you to understand that winter is an ally, it's not an enemy. And that is in class 2101. That class will be presented in the future. It'll also be recorded. There is a DVD that's available right now. We call it the Self-Reliance Series, Part 2, which is on clothing. It'll teach you many of these principles. And then we have the ongoing class series right now, Winter Without Worries, which takes about 24 instruction hours to get through. And again, it is being recorded, so it will be available to people. Winter injury threats. And these can be very, very serious. There's 4 of them. We don't go into much depth right here, but they are hypothermia, frostbite, snow blindness, and trench foot. Frostbite, you don't want to go here. The real problem with frostbite is not just the frozen member themselves. They can literally become stiff and hard. When they thaw out, there's a lot of damage to them. If they're not properly treated when they're thawed out, you're going to lose them. And if you don't have medical treatment to take care of them, it is the infection that follows frostbite. That's what turns deadly. And that is where people literally die from those things, because when you have decaying flesh attached to your body, that's not a good thing. And in the winter classes, we go into that much greater. In Winter Without Worries in particular, we talk about in depth the prevention and the treatment of frostbite. Hypothermia truly is one of the most serious threats faced during emergencies, and it doesn't have to be the dead of winter. It doesn't have to be below zero. As a matter of fact, we lose more people to hypothermia above freezing than we do below zero. So hypothermia is a serious, serious problem. It's not well respected. It's not well understood. In these other classes where we have time, we dig into it much deeper to help you understand, because it is the killer of ignorant and unprepared people. It is a big threat, and you need to know the symptoms. You need to know when to act. You need to know how to act. And every one of us has experienced some level of hypothermia. When we do the live classes, I always ask for a show of hands. How many people have been in hypothermia? Few people put their hands up. Then I ask the other question, how many people in this room have ever shivered? Everybody puts their hands up. Shivering is a symptom of mild hypothermia. It's not dangerous, it's not threatening, but your core temperature is going down. That's the reason you shiver. So we'll talk in great depth in these other classes about that. It is very, very threatening, and if you're not prepared for it, it can turn deadly in a hurry. Well, we have people, they already live and work in the winter. I mean, right now we're in the midst of winter down here at my house. It's been near zero or below zero. Our communities around us have been as cold as 5 below. That'll classify as winter, and it can be threatening. And so a lot of people already have clothing and have experience with it out there. And so we just kind of go like, well, I know what to do. I ask people this simple question, so how's it been working out for them? Well, in most cases, we find that people, they're wet, they're cold, they suffer pain, in some cases injury, hopefully just minor, and they learn to avoid winter every possible way. I was down at a shop picking up a car that was in for repairs and talking to an individual and said, well, looks like winter's here. And he says, yeah, he says, I wish I could avoid the thing. He talked about how much he didn't want winter to come. Well, the problem is it comes every year just about this time, and since it will occur, you need to be prepared to deal with it. And emergencies, of course, can do and will happen in the winter. So I asked those a series of questions, and then to you and each one of us, so how's it working out? Do you experience any of those things? And if you do, that means there might be some things to learn, some new practices, some understanding, some principles perhaps you don't know. One of the things that people have a tendency to do is just go down to the store, go to the outfitting store, the winter store, the camping store, the coat store, whoever it is, go in there and just buy some more winter clothing to put on. And very often they'll talk to a salesman about what they should get, and they'll point you to something and tell you how wonderful it is. Well, I'm pretty bottom line about things, because in the clothing industry and the cold weather industry, manufacturers and marketers of winter clothing either don't understand or they lie about these things. Now, hopefully it's just out of ignorance, but in some cases, I'm not so sure. About managing moisture. There's a whole bunch of stuff about managing moisture. It's called breathability and all these kinds of things. And so they give you waterproofing and waterproof breathable and talk about all their wonderful materials and what have you. And you're still wet and cold out there. about insulation. And you're fed a bunch of baloney about what insulation is and all the numerical space age kinds of things, and they put these trade names on them and spend, literally millions of dollars in marketing on the things. Insulation is very simple when you understand how it works. You can do some marvelous things, and a lot of it's with things that are not on the market in terms of clothing. True performance. Now there's a big one. You ever buy a sleeping bag based on a hang tag or a coat or a pair of boots? There's boots around. You can find them in the catalogs rated for 100 below zero. Sleeping bags 20 below zero. Get one of those 20 below zero sleeping bags and sleep in it at 10 above. You're probably freezing your hiney off. The hang tags are the biggest bunch of baloney that I've ever seen. And I used to wonder how and why they get those numbers on there. Well, I know. We talk about that in the other classes. So the true performance of the clothing, what is it really based on what some marketer would like you to think that it is? And there's this big race to see who can put the lowest number on there for the cold weather clothing. How to stay warm and dry. Dry being the big word on there. And that's one of them. Again, you're sold on the concept of waterproofing and waterproof breathable for the cold and the extreme cold. Waterproofing will kill you. It's one of the taboos of winter and extreme cold. Now, there's a place for waterproofing. There's a place for waterproof breathable. But when it gets well below freezing, it has no place. It has no use. As a matter of fact, it's hazardous. In these other classes, we'll explain all of those things to you carefully. What I'm going to show you as we go through some of these things, it's not about some of the things that I have done, my travel log and these things. I just know how to talk about me or people I've been around. But each one of these slides has a meaning to it to help you understand some things. Again, this is a very brief overview, so we can't go into them real deep, but it'll plant some seeds. And about the ideas, about the principles that I want to share with you, not just about some of the things that I've done, it's about what anybody can do. And we have some people gaining wonderful experience that I just enjoy listening to. So, definite purpose to each one of these. And the idea is to help you have a different outcome. And it's by doing things differently, and it's based on correct principles, which actually are understood by very few people. Is kind of the bottom line. Now, it all began with us, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I say us, with my parents, with my father, back in 1957. That's when we started our serious snow camping. We were cold much of the time. In fact, most of the time. We were wet, in spite of everything we tried to do and being told to do. Nights were long, they were miserable, and our feet really suffered. We had great trouble with them. So the foundation of all of this really began with my father. He's literally the genesis for all of this. He is the father of what I teach. I started my learning from him. He was the one that, if you will, drug me out there. 1957, first snow camp. I went because he was my hero. He was my first and best friend. He was going, I wanted to go. But it was hideous, comes to mind when I think about it. In the early days, we were fire-based. Everything we did, we had to have fire. You always had campfires, big fires. And in that upper left-hand picture there, you can see me standing off to the right of the fire, and I'm playing the game you call rotisserie, where you just slowly rotate around on there, trying to get warmed up from that fire. Of course, the side that's away from the fire is now freezing. So I've played, days and days of rotisserie out there. 1961, we started taking snowshoe trips into the high Rocky Mountains in winter. But this was the last trip in which we used boots and socks for winter camping because our feet were such a terrible problem out there. In 1962, they looked like that. In 64, these mucklucks. In 1967, I needed to make them so they would be bigger. So I figured out a way to make them. And then we went through experimenting, developing, designing, and coming up with things for the feet that work better. But if you can take care of the feet, you can do the hands, and you can make them look quite good. The clothing sometimes, as I point out, looks kind of ugly, kind of dorky out there. But remember, it's about performance first and all, above everything else. Once you have the performance there, then you can work on making things look better. But I'm going to focus on performance first, because if I put style ahead of performance, you're going to be freezing your hiney off like all the people are all the time right now. So people would ask, why would we do these things? A variety of reasons. But the bottom line was it was because we could. We started going for adventure and beauty out of curiosity and understanding, and then ultimately we could go out there just because we could into environments like this, where it's in the continuous cold in the Alaskan wilderness areas. the Pecos Wilderness of New Mexico. That's a bedroom shot right there. Here's another bedroom shot in Utah up on the skyline, where I'm not even out of my sleeping bag again, and just snap a picture, walking the ridges, watching the sunsets, marvelous things like that. And the bottom line is this: the possibilities can go way beyond what you would normally think of, well below zero, 24 hours a day, continuous for weeks on end, and you can do it without the requirement for shelter or heat. That allowed us to take a trip in 1967, the first one to the Arctic. We left home in our Arctic clothing. There's a message in that. You can wear this, and it has a very broad temperature range when you do things right. You don't do it right, the temperature range is very narrow. So walk off the plane at 20 below zero, didn't have to put anything on because basically you were wearing it except hat and mittens, then you put them on. Spent 2 weeks up there, an amazing environment to be in and to enjoy. We could do it because we could, because we were comfortable, because we were safe, and I enjoy helping other people get out in those kinds of environments for recreation reasons, but there's even more important reasons to do this, for disasters and emergencies. So because of what we were learning, we can now go places we hadn't been able to go before. And this is not about turning you into an Arctic snow camper. You can find these temperatures right in our mountains. As a matter of fact, what was it, 2 nights ago, up in Peter Sinks in Utah, it was 43 below zero here 2 nights ago. So we do have these little pockets of severe cold even here that we can get ourselves into. That meant that Middle Sinks, where people this 2 years ago were camping up on the ridge above Middle Sinks, it wasn't probably not quite that cold, but I'll bet it was 35 below zero in Peter Sinks. Easy to get to. We'll have to go back again. Hopefully we'll catch the cold. Stand on mountain peaks, go places that you couldn't go with traditional clothing, and into the extremes. And these are some of our Snow College alumni from a couple of years ago, and we look forward to going back out there again and enjoying that. These are all first-timers doing it this way. Some of them hadn't snow camped at all. Well, winter and cold weather can, of course, be hazardous, but the principle is this one. If you know how to swim, it doesn't make any difference how deep the water is. If you really know how to stay warm, it doesn't make any difference how cold it is. So we're talking about breaking the cold barrier and teaching people how to do that in its non-traditional methods. Clothing is personal portable shelter, as we said before, because it is your first and most important line of weather protection. And my message is one of hope, because a lot of people feel threatened by winter. A lot of people talk about how much they hope they don't have an emergency in the winter. And they pray that it won't happen. Well, what if it does? You need to be prepared to deal with these things. The greater purpose, of course, is this, because things happen at home. You're in the wilderness, it's unexpected, and they happen just because they do. Earthquakes and strandings and power outages and blizzards and all kinds of things. You know, cars, if you have a car, you drive them enough someplace, they're going to quit. And they will quit in the worst of conditions. And I've been out there many times, either with a car not working or it is just downright stuck and you're not going anyplace. And you can only run the heater for so long, and in some cases, running the heater is absolutely hazardous to keep that engine going. And we kill people each year because they tried to stay in their vehicle, run the heater, and they were not prepared to be out of it. It is shelter. You just need to be prepared to stay in it without any heat. As that picture in the upper left-hand corner, when that Jeep, and the roads were absolutely closed, and we were stuck at Wolf Creek Pass in a horrific blizzard. No big deal. You can enjoy it. You get to go snow camping. Things fall down, break, can come apart. We have extreme blizzards in cities that get people stranded and get them uncomfortable. And one of the big things, of course, that can happen, and this does catch literally millions of people sometimes, and that's when those extreme storms come in and they take out the power, they knock out the power grid and communications, and there you are with no heat in the winter. And we've had people in our area up north from here, some of them went quite a few days in this winter weather without electricity, and electricity usually is what you need to run your furnace and other things. So you don't want to be standing around that thermostat on the wall, staring at it in the dark, thinking it's going to do something for you and hoping it'll come along and fix something. It can't do that. The responsibility is yours, and be prepared to do that. So here again, wanting to teach people the principles of what you can do so you can be prepared. Because winter safety is all about preparation, it's all about prevention, being prepared ahead of time. Well, for severe conditions, for winter and extreme cold, it need not be a threat. But let's talk about what might be considered extreme, and that is if your exposure includes below zero air temperatures or wind chill. You know, the thermometer doesn't have to read below zero for you to have experiences that are as hazardous as below zero. 20 degrees with a 30-mile-an-hour wind, you're below zero wind chill, and that can get you in trouble in a hurry. If you're going to be living outside for extended periods of time, out in the elements where the temperatures are colder than 20 degrees, either sensible or wind chill, if you're going to be exposed out there, that would be considered an extreme. If you're sleeping outside in the elements, you know, you can fake it for a night, and the scouts do that all the time. They go out on their Klondike derbies and, you know, spend one night out there and get through it. And then come back and vow that they'll never go again. What if you have to sleep outside and it's 20 degrees, 15 degrees, 10 degrees? What if you're staying outside for several days simply because you have to for whatever reason? That would be extreme. And if you need to or have the possibility of being caught where you don't have any fire or shelter out in winter conditions, then that's an extreme. So any of those considerations would be extreme. Well, what you need is the PAL system, and that's what we talk about. That's what Winter Without Worries is all about, teaching in depth. We just touch on it here because it allows you to be exposed in temperatures colder than 20 degrees. You can be out in wind chills of minus 100. I've done that. Extended periods outside. I've lived outside below zero for more than 2 weeks. No shelter, no fire is required. In fact, the last part of the Winter Without Worries class we call Without Fire Shelter because it's learning how to do that should that occur. And it's not that hard. Well, if you're prepared to deal with the extremes, then milder conditions are a snap. They're easy. So you prepare for the extreme, and then if they don't happen, no big deal. Well, the Phillips Arctic Living System, and the key word here, of course, is system, because it's not just clothing. We're talking about clothing in this class, but when we take a look at the idea of being able to stay out there, it's not just the clothing. The foam clothing is a key component. It's really what allows the other things to work. But there are skills you must understand. There is the doctrine of being out there, excuse me, the doctrine and the understanding of what to do and what to not do. It is about understanding of the cold and the body's physiological response to the cold. Hey, if you have cold feet, you need to understand why. Well, now, if you're standing outside at below zero in sneakers, it's pretty easy to figure out. But let's say you're wearing some of this clothing. I showed you pictures of footwear earlier. Footwear that's good for 40, 50, 60 below zero. In fact, it's been used at the South Pole at colder than 120 below zero. And we got a fax back on that. It was kind of fun. So we can say here you have footwear that's really designed for the extremes. And if you have cold feet in them, why do you have cold feet in them? You need to understand why. You have to be able to diagnose what's going on, because then you can fix it. So this understanding is critically important. And then the other part of the PAL system that's not optional, and that is confidence that is based on having been there and done that. You go outside, you play with this stuff, you gain experience with it. All right, what I'm talking about is not a theory. It's not just a nice idea that showed up a few weeks ago or a couple of years ago. There are decades of experience working with these things, and research, and then feedback from other people. Technical and performance testing that's been done through the years in cold box with thermocouples on the body, on the feet in particular. I've done a lot of work with footwear because the traditional footwear is so dismal. And developing these things and knowing that you can sit sedentary for hours at 30 below zero and not get cold feet. And I've sat in that cold box for hours working away to determine how well it worked. By the way, that picture in the lower right-hand corner, this 51.3 degrees, that was not on the PAL's boot foot. That was the competitive boot. And I'll tell you, 51.3 on your feet hurts like crazy. Sleeping in cold chambers, I've spent a lot of time with frozen food in there. in the clothing, in sleeping bags, so I know what I can do outside. Doing testing for long periods of time, recording the data, and then fixing things that are not working right. Getting wind, in this case, that's a fan that's blowing into my face, so I know that I can stand on top of mountain peaks in the extreme winds. And I encourage you to play with things, but don't go into the extremes the first time you put something together. You work up to it, you gain the experience. Some comparative clothing testing that was done, the performance. This was a fun trip. We spent a lot of time on this in the classes. Here I'll just touch on it. This is Resolute Bay, Northwest Territories. It's now called Nunavut up there. They changed the territory name. We're almost 1,000 miles north of the Arctic Circle. That was our camp. And we're wearing different clothing. In this case, I have on some of the competitive clothing. This is the military's EQUEX system, which is layers of polypropylene and fleece, Gore-Tex, Thinsulate, those kinds of things, the Mickey Mouse boost, whole thing. Thermocouples taped onto the body so we can measure. It isn't just how I think I feel, it's how I measure that I feel. On the feet, so we can measure the footwear performance. On the toes, and then I have, pages of graphed data. The interesting part being here, during the first 4 days wearing EQUEX, and then shifting over to the PALs. Now, this was a 4-day clothing rotation cycle, and you'll notice at the end of the 4th day going into the 5th day, that's a shoulder temperature, that yellow line up top, and it's dipped down to just under 80 degrees. It's like 79.5 degrees, and I'll tell you that is one cold shoulder. Doesn't sound that bad, but when you look at the rest of this, it's a real problem. The green line is foot temperature, and the E stands for exercise. Those are periods of exercise. And the things that's important to notice is that the peak at the E is down day after day after day. It's lower, and even on the 4th day with that E down there, I got my foot up to like 59.5 degrees, and that was after walking uphill for several miles. And that was as warm as I could get them. And there's a real story in this graph. We spend more time on the hypothermia area, because now look at the core temperature, which is the blue line up there, and you see exactly what's going on. The core temperature is going down and everything else is crashing, and this is the story of the extremities and everything else. Well, on the 5th day, I changed clothing. I got out of the stuff on the left over there, put on that's on the right, dorky as it looks. But I'll tell you what, take a look at what happens to the temperatures at this time. Core temperature rebounds, foot temperature rebounds, shoulder temperature, everything rebounds. They come up where they should be. And for the rest of the trip, since I stayed in PALS, my core temperature was rock solid the rest of the way across. So you see right there this rebound, and all I did was change clothing. As a matter of fact, I changed the clothing outside because there wasn't really any inside to get into where I could stand up and change. So you strip down, put on the other stuff, and boy, did it feel good. The other thing I would point out during the period of time of using the layered system that we had, that was during the warm period. It wasn't during the coldest period that we were in up there. And I just mentioned a word that it will be counterintuitive to a lot of people is, for the extremes, we do not layer. Layers do not work. Well, they work, but they have some serious problems that will not be easily overcome in the cold. It takes so much maintenance to maintain them. So we don't layer. It's a monolayer system. Greater depth than other classes. What others have to say, a lot's written up in magazines and books. Then the previous edition of the Boy Scout Field Book, you can read part of the story, how to make some things. In 1989, I went back to New York to receive from Popular Science one of their What's Best and New in Science and Technology for the year. Outfitted and trained Commander Jim Lovell for a private trip to the North Pole. He had some rather kind words to say about the clothing and his intention to keep using it. In fact, he still has the clothing. Having visited with him a while back, he has it and has kind words to say. We'll be talking to him more. Now, what I've just shown you was to set you up for what I really wanted to tell you, and it's to give you a little bit of hope that this isn't just some wild idea that somebody thought might work, which is one of the challenges you have with a lot of things, particularly in the preparedness area. Somebody reads somebody else's book and they keep passing it around, but the guys that are writing this stuff never actually use it. I dare you to use some of this stuff that they write about out there. You try it and see what you think. We'll talk about that in some of the other classes, including one that I want to do about some of the reality shows on survival, some of the most dangerous shows I've ever seen, teaching people how to get themselves killed out there in a hurry. We'll be talking about those things. So I don't want you to reject the concepts I'm going to tell you momentarily, and so that's why to give you some of this history and background so we can plant some ideas. I break the traditional rules. I don't do what others do. I don't do what the big companies and the famous brands do. We'll teach you to do something different. But our outcome is far different and far better. And I already mentioned one of these things. In fact, you'll see more of them in just a moment right here. We don't use layering in this extreme because layerings break down. They fail. They will get you in trouble. You can learn everything that you need to know to change from the current experiences that you have and the expectations, feelings, thoughts about winter and surviving in the winter if something really goes wrong. You can change your whole outlook and attitude about those things to have a very different outcome by doing some things very differently. And it's all based on principles, not the traditions of men, not the habits of what some company has in mind that they want to tell you to buy, and so they market to you. I prefer to just teach you on why things work, and then you make a decision rather than getting you hyped about purchasing something. So it is the Phillips Arctic Living System. It has, once again, these things: skills, doctrine, foam clothing, an understanding of the cold, how and why things work in the body out there, and then experience. If you did everything else and you haven't gained experience with it, you're not living the system because you don't know that you know how things will work. Okay. PALS is all about breaking the cold barrier. Here are the 9 key PALS principles. Now, by the way, there's many sub-principles and a whole bunch of little components to it, but these are some of these big ones that'll set you up to understand how different we do things. First off, exposure. With PALS, you can literally live outside 24 hours a day, 7 days a week below zero. You can be exposed for long periods of time. Now, the clothing needs to be right, the doctrine, the skills, the understanding needs to be correct for you to be able to do that. But if you do it right, you can do that. Understanding of insulation, I mentioned that as one of the things that these companies don't have really an understanding of, and or they don't tell you the reality about insulation. We'll teach you all about that in Winter Without Worries, and I think it's next week we'll be going into that one in depth. Waterproofing will kill you. Absolutely, it will kill you. It's very, very hazardous. It has no place in the cold and extreme cold. There's a place for it in moderate cold, in temperatures above freezing or around freezing, or if you're going to be in a very wet situation. You know, if you're diving below the ice in Antarctica, you probably need some waterproof clothing on, a dry suit. But other than situations like that, in the extreme cold, it'll get you in trouble. And waterproof breathable is a myth. It sells very well. It's been marketed extremely well. It's a great idea, and I wish the heck it really worked, because if it really worked, I would use it. Lots of pictures of ice inside of Gore-Tex that will show you, and if you talk to anybody that really uses the stuff, they'll talk about how wet they got inside of their Gore-Tex and how much ice they got inside of it. Hydrophilic materials are deadly. What are the hydrophilic materials? Down, cotton, and here's a biggie that breaks tradition: wool. Now, wool is the best of the naturals to use, and if you're going to use a natural or that's all that you have, then you want wool, because wool is far better than cotton or down. But compared to the things that you can do with the synthetics and that we'll teach you, wool is really poor. So hydrophilic materials are a real problem, and cotton is called the death fabric in many circles in the cold. It's a hot weather fabric. It does great in the heat because it'll help cool you, but you do not want it in the cold. Go beyond the limits of layering. Now, layering has its place. In fact, all of us use layering all the time. Unfortunately, layering is taught as though it's a religion. Back in the late 60s and 70s is where they started talking about this thing called layering. And it's been taught as a doctrine that you must not break. Well, to just counter that for a little bit, show me one animal in the world that lives in the extreme cold: caribou, reindeer, Arctic fox, ptarmigan, the polar bear, any of those. Show me one of those that layers. They do not layer, because the creator of all of those things knew what the heck he was doing. You don't layer. Layers build moisture in between the layers. I don't care what the material is. We don't even layer with the things that we're doing. We'll teach that in depth in here. Now, layers have their places, I said, but if you're getting into the cold in extremes, you need to go beyond the limits of layering. The layering is very limited. The physiological response of the body to the cold, how and why this works, that goes back to this idea I said, if you have cold feet and you have some, what would look like it would be good footwear on and your feet are cold, there's a reason for it. And if you can analyze that, you can solve the problem. Hydration is the cardinal rule. Hydration is critically important in the heat and extreme heat. It's critically important, just as important in the cold, because you dehydrate very rapidly in the cold. You'll dehydrate as rapidly at 20 below zero as you do at 120 above zero. And if you don't take care of the problem, you simply end up, in this case, going into hypothermia. Dehydration, as I have taught for decades now, is the primary trigger to hypothermia. Dehydration is the primary trigger to hypothermia. Knowledge is not optional. That brings us back to this idea of gaining experience with things. You must have experience. You must work up to it and do it in a very orderly and a very controlled way, because in the beginning, it's easy to make mistakes. I've made tons of them. I like to teach people how to avoid those things, but you'll probably stumble into some of them anyway, and you work your way around them by not putting yourself at great risk to begin with. Well, these things are vital that you understand them and that you're prepared to deal with them. So PALS is a part of total winter preparedness. And remember, it's not just the clothing. Sometimes, because I've been teaching this literally full-time most of the time since 1983, 84, and a lot of times people say, I got the foam clothing, I'm okay, I don't need the rest of the stuff. It's a system. If you're wearing the foam clothing and the PALS clothing, and it can be perfectly done, perfectly right, if you dehydrate, you'll die. And there's other things that will get you in trouble, you must understand. All right, so with PALS, as far as the foam clothing goes, you either buy it or build it, and then you learn the rest of the system. So you get the correct instruction, you can get the simple tools, learn how to do this. Even if you plan to buy these things, I recommend you still learn how to make it so that if you have to, you can. You've got to get the right materials. This is where there's a lot of mistakes that are being made, a lot of misunderstanding. So it's critically important you get the right materials, learn some of these simple skills. You can learn to make these things that will take care of your body from head to foot. And yes, you make your own footwear. And you have things that can look like any one of those. We've had people make thousands of their own footwear to take care of them out there, and their own clothing that looks like this. And they can be, the patterns don't matter out there, the colors don't matter. It is the fabric that is critical. And then you get the right experience with people that have been out there, been doing it. It's one of the things I enjoy doing, but there's other people being trained. They can take you out and teach you. Spend time out there, as these folks did back in February of 2010, and that's our classroom. That's our kitchen and our classroom out there, right out in the open, in the exposed, no tent. We're not sleeping inside of anything out there, just sleep out inside of the environment. When you have the right clothing, and remember, bedding is a part of that, you stay outside, and there is no age limit as long as the health is good and you can be, take care of the things that need to be done. In the case of children, there need to be adults there to help them along. Now, some people say, but I'm not going snow camping. Well, at least that's the plan that you may in fact have. And there's all kinds of reasons to say, well, I'm not going to be exposed to the cold because I live in Florida or South Carolina or Southern California, Arizona. Well, that may be true as long as you can always stay there. Sometimes it gets pretty chilly in those places too. And as a matter of fact, it can be cold enough in those areas that if you're not prepared with even moderate clothing, you're in trouble. And I'm never going snow camping because that's really a stupid idea, right? Why would you do that? Well, you may not plan on going snow camping, but you can find yourself outside. I always have an RV with a furnace in it. Well, what if you run out of fuel? What if you don't have the RV? I'm going to have a tent with a stove. A tent with a stove, that's a lot of wood, folks, to try and keep it warm. People that live in tents for a short period of time, you can do some cooking and warm it up a little bit. But if you're going to have a mountain of wood to take care of it, even if you have an insulated structure, it still takes a lot of wood. And then I'll just move to where it's warm. Well, maybe you will, maybe you won't. Maybe you try to get back to where it is warm where you used to live, but got yourself trapped along the way, and now you can't get back. So you need to be prepared for the worst. This is my whole attitude about it. where exposure is less rigorous. And the big one is just loss of utilities. You have a house, you have windows and doors and a roof over your head, you're inside, you're not out in the blowing snow and the extreme colds outside, but the inside can get really, really chilly. And when the utilities are off for an extended periods of time. A lot of people say, well, just wood burning stove and a big pile of wood. Well, what's the reality of this? How practical is that? Will that really work? So we take a look at what's the reality. Well, auxiliary heat for your house. You need to understand that for most households, even short-term auxiliary heat isn't going to work very well. And for long-term, it's literally impossible except for a very small number of people that live in a forest, have a small house, and have plenty of firewood and fireplaces in there. And some people say, yeah, but the pioneers, they heated with wood. Please understand, they had a house the size of your kitchen, in fact, a little smaller than a lot of kitchens, and they didn't heat it all the time, and they still had to have this mountain of wood. So we ask the question, does your house care if it is warm or cold? The reality is your house doesn't care. So is there a solution? Well, the solution we've already been talking about, really. Is it about having a warm house? A warm house is a nice cultural habit, and it's very comfortable. I enjoy my heated house, and I hope that it will always be heated. But what if for some reason it is not, and it can't be? So it's really about keeping you warm, not the house warm, is what it comes down to. And the only realistic long-term solution is proper clothing. It doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have any heat. It just means that, well, it might be a little more practical to keep the house above freezing so that things don't freeze in the house. And then you just use the clothing. Or it might be that there's no way to even heat the house. And if you're outside in a tent or an RV and you've run out of propane, you know, it takes a lot of propane to keep a RV running for very long because they're not designed to be unheated for extended periods of time at below zero. So what are you going to do? That's always the question. Well, this clothing that we talk about can be worn 24/7 continuously for weeks at a time because of how it handles moisture. The moisture handling is the magic when you understand how to do it. You can leave the insulation on and change the outside shells, different things like that. You sleep in it. Literally, you might take off the dirty outer clothing and put pajamas on over top, or just go to bed in your super insulated underwear, in your regular bedding or in sleeping bags. You can make these things. You know, Karen has done it. Other people have done it. I know dozens, hundreds of people that have. If they can, you can too if you want to build it. So again, the key word is system. It is the foam clothing. It is the skills. It is the doctrine. It is the understanding. And it is the experience. Hypothermia is one of the greatest threats faced during an emergency, even during milder conditions. You need to be prepared to deal with it. Winter, snow, and cold weather should be your ally rather than a threat. There are advantages to the cold weather in the winter. There's things that it will do for you that are hard to take care of and control. And let's just touch one of those briefly because I talk about it in greater depth in other classes. When it's really, really cold, well, let's put it to you this way. Suppose there was some gnarly, really nasty disease that was accidentally cut loose or on purpose cut loose, and you hear about people that are getting sick in all the shelters and places like that, and they're trying to shelter in and they're dying. I'll tell you what, you move outside and live in an igloo, you won't get sick. Disease does not spread in the cold and the extreme cold. It only spreads where people are clumped together in a warm setting. So go outside. You don't get sick from the cold. You get sick from being around sick people in the warm. So there's one way that it may help you. Another one is when things really go bad and it's the middle of winter in the cold areas, you don't have a lot of street people wandering around out there. They stay away. They're going to go to the warm climates. Will you live providently? The choice is yours. And it really is about making provisions in all of these different areas that we talked about. In this case, we're talking about for the heat and for the cold. Because if you do that, then you can face the future with confidence. You can face the future with hope. It doesn't have to be faced with fear and trepidation. Keep in mind, life happens. And you need to be prepared to deal with the worst of things that could possibly occur, because if you're prepared to meet them, then it becomes an adventure rather than something that you're struggling to survive through. True preparedness is based on principles, not just things to buy and stuff to store away. It's what you know, what's inside of you, what you can do at your fingertips with the tools and materials you have around you and what you've prepared yourself to be able to do. So it's a lifestyle, and I encourage people, please make it a lifestyle. You just don't buy stuff and shove it in the closet or in the basement. You play with it, you use it. We talked about that last night on the audio broadcast about if you have a sun oven, for goodness sakes, use the thing. Play with it, get some experience with it. You may not cook with it all the time, but now you know what to do and how it works. So do that with all the things that you have. Gain experience with them. It's just about playing, and for goodness sake, do it for positive reasons and for fun reasons, not because you're afraid of something. You do these things so that you'll know you don't have to be afraid of them. Well, this is the conclusion of this clothing class, the beginning of them, the 2001. Weather happens. People are very poorly prepared to live without shelters and or utilities. You can get more information on the cold weather side of this in this DVD that's available through the website or at the store. It's the Self-Reliance Series Part 2, which is on clothing. It will go into greater depth on some of these principles that we have here. And of course, those of you that can, I encourage you to attend live the Winter Without Worry series that's going on every Saturday now. And it is being recorded. It will be made available to you folks at distance. Just watch for it, announcements of those things. So as always, the responsibility belongs to each one of us. My responsibility and Safe Harbor Alliance responsibility, because we've chosen that, we believe it's what we're supposed to do, is to do everything we can to get information, training, and to you so that you can make the right decisions. Some of that, of course, will be on Tuesday nights, as I've mentioned, with the interviews that we do. We have our regular Wednesday night broadcast in person at Cabela's or over the internet. The newsletter that is available to you, and through the new website, things will work really, really slick. It's been worked on for months now to get the completely reprogrammed from the bottom up so that it'll function the way that we would like it to. And we'll encourage people to go there and register. We come to the end of this, and anybody that has any questions, right? The Winter Without Worries class on Saturday, is it only lecture slides? Hands-on, actually, we don't build anything in the class. It would end up being a 3-month class if we did that. There are things to touch and feel. There are things that you will get to look at and handle. We do not build anything in. Well, we do one portion of the class where we are gluing things. You need to understand the adhesive technique, and typically we have people do that one so you can get a little skill with that, get a feel for that. So there are some things that you will get to do a little bit by hands, but there is not time to, we're not going to take time to build things in the class. You'll need to do that on your own. Any other questions anybody have? Okay, can you describe how to make a foam sleeping bag? Well, yeah, the sleeping bag class takes about 2 hours, but let me give you some guidelines on this very briefly. The sleeping bag for the winter, we're going to use 1.5-inch foam. I make a 3-season bag, a summer bag, spring, summer, fall, out of 1-inch foam. The 3-season bag is usually just large enough for you to get into with your regular clothing on, but the winter sleeping bag, the Arctic bag, is big enough for you to get in it with your 1-inch clothing on. So it's going to be a larger bag, because I'm wearing part of my bedding all the time in the case of my clothing. So number one, it's going to be big enough. You'll need to size it accordingly. You have essentially 2 construction methods that you can use for putting together a sleeping bag. One of them will be with an adhesive. The other one is by sewing it. Now, if you're going to sew the sleeping bag, keep in mind this is sewing through fabric and foam that's going to be 3 inches thick. And you can't even consider that a home sewing machine would do that. It does take a specialized, I shouldn't say specialized, but it does take an industrial machine of just the right type. It's called a walking foot needle feed machine. And it's one that has a very high lift on the foot, and it's a very long stroke on the feed mechanism. More information on that in the classes. In fact, I've done filming of the sewing exercise. You'll be able to see that in the class, and of course it'll be in the coming DVDs. So those are the 2 ways. You either need to have access to such a sewing machine or buy one. They cost about $3,000. Some people go in together and get one. There's some people that buy them and then allow other people to use them, depending on where you are. There's some folks in the Utah area that have these machines. They just want people to have the clothing so you can come use them. If you're local to them, we'll let you know who they are, make arrangements to get in with them. The adhesive method is what we had to start with because I didn't know how to sew anything in the beginning, and we didn't have sewing machines, so we learned to glue them together. You will have a fabric on the inside that will be a very open, very breathable, kind of like a screen door. I mean, it doesn't have to do anything other than protect the foam and make it slippery so you can slide inside. The outside of the sleeping bag wants to be covered with something that says all synthetic, polyester or nylon, tightly woven, very thin, no coating, no waterproofing, no waterproof breathable on it. You'll be able to blow a little bit of air through it, but not much. But because of it being very thin and being made from a very fine denier fabric, it will allow the moisture to get through. The outer fabric and the inner fabrics, if you're doing the glue method, you can sew them, and the outside just slips over top. The inner one slides down inside, and then you secure it to the inside by pulling some tabs through. We'll show you how to do that. In fact, you see that in the mitten class. Little ribbons that stick out through the foam that are tied into it, so now that lining doesn't move around. And then around the opening, depending on the style that you've chosen, is where you can attach those fabrics together and attach them to the foam. There's different closure methods. There's a tuck flap. There's draw cord. There's zippers. There's different ways that people make them. We'll show you how to do those things in the class. So just as a thumbnail, either glue it or sew it. The fabrics need to be on the inside and the outside. There's more to the sleeping system than just the bag. There are two other critical components. One of them is a moisture handling pad. The other one is a de-icing cloth. Those are all part of the system. And if you don't have the moisture handling pad and de-icing cloth, you will not get the long-term performance of handling moisture. Excuse me. So those are all covered in depth in the class, but the moisture handling pad is another open cell piece of foam, 1 inch thick, but it's a much firmer foam. And contrary to the tradition that says what you want to have is a closed cell pad or a thermarest or any of those things, those are great for the summer. You do not want them in the winter because all they will do is trap moisture against the bottom of your sleeping bag. The moisture handling pad's job is to move moisture away from the bottom of your sleeping bag, hence it's called the moisture handling pad, MHP. And then it sends it to the de-icing cloth, which is underneath that, which is parachute fabric. Again, a very thin, not quite as tightly woven as the outer sleeping bag, and we like to use the parachute fabric, and it goes underneath, and that's on top of your ground cloth, bottom of your tent, plastic sheet, you wrapped it in, bivy sack, whatever it is, and that's where the moisture that comes out the bottom of your sleeping bag freezes, and it captures it right there so you can remove it. You de-ice your sleeping system by every day or two, just pulling out that de-icing cloth, wad it up, which shatters the ice and it just falls out as a powder, put it back. Without the de-icing cloth and the moisture handling pad, you end up with ice building in the bottom of your sleeping bag. I don't care what it's made out of. In the case of the foam, it will start to collect there also. Foam is not magic, but when you have the whole system, you can then understand how to take care of yourself out there. So it is a system. That's why I emphasize that again and again. Let's see. What is the best way to compress the pad bag for backpacking? We put the sleeping bag in a compressor bag that will squeeze it down so that it will now be smaller to do that. And we use a moisture handling pad. It goes into a compressor bag, and it also goes inside of the, or you have the sleeping bag that can go inside of a compressor bag also. And you can now squeeze it down with straps on it so it'll make it much smaller. And that's how you get it to a compact size so you can backpack with it. The sleeping bags, the foam bags will be larger than, say, a down sleeping bag. They will be larger, but you can squeeze it down so it is backpackable and it can be hauled out there. Anyway, we'll talk to you once again next week. Good night. This is Jim Phillips with Safe Harbor Alliance.